My name is Brooke Stefanczyk, and I'm a Ag and Natural Resources Extension Educator for Purdue based out of Sullivan County. And today I'm going to be talking about forage testing and then a little bit about how to take that forage test as well as the test that you use with your hands and your eyes together to think about the quality of hay that you're feeding for cattle and other animals as well. So why should we think about sampling our hay or using a forage test? It takes the guesswork out, or a lot of the guesswork out in feeding animals. I don't know that you can ever completely take the guesswork out, but you can get pretty close. You can save money because when you know what's in your hay, then you can more precisely supplement and stuff without just supplementing without any direction. You may be over supplementing and spending more money than you need to be. And then if you're more accurately meeting your nutritional needs, you have the chance to increase your reproductive rates. Now, we know there's a lot of stuff that goes into reproduction, but nutrition is a big component of it. So forage testing isn't an end-all be-all. It can't tell us a lot of things, like are there poisonous weeds in the hay? There are some weeds that are very poisonous but would show up with a high protein and low fiber content in a forage test, and you would think it would be the best hay. It's not going to be able to tell us if it's moldy, if there's maybe dead animals in the hay that could cause botulism. Is there foxtail in the hay that's going to cause sores in the mouth? So it's definitely a need to actually look at the hay as well as use the forage test together. So forage testing is a best management practice. So you want to get an accurate forage test and then use sensory analysis to get a good idea of what's in your hay and how it can be used to meet the nutritional needs of your cattle. So you have an advantage here on the forage testing if you grow the hay yourself, because you know, more likely know what species are in the hay, if you have weed issues in those fields that you're baling, if you got it baled early or late, if it got rained on. So sometimes going in, if you're just buying hay from someone else, you may not know all of that, versus if you grew it yourself, then that's some stuff that you know that you can use along with the forage test. So one of the important things to note is that the lab analysis is only as good as the sample that you take. So we want to take a good representative sample across our hays so that we get a good sample back from the lab. And so this picture is what you don't want to do, which is cutting corners. So we're going to go through the best management practices of forage testing so that you can get good samples for your lab so you can make good nutritional decisions after that. So to take a good representative sample, first, we only want to sample from a like set of bales, so from one cutting and from one type and one field. So I have our example field on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint, and we have a dark green and a light green section. So maybe this is a sloped where the light green is in a lower position. And let's say last winter it was so we have alfalfa grass mix in this field, and in the lower part it freezed and a lot of the alfalfa heaved and died, so now it's mainly grass, but the upper part of that field is still a good mix of alfalfa and grass. In that situation, you would want to sample those two halves of the field separately, because that alfalfa is going to strongly influence the nutritional content of those hays. So even though they're in the same field now, because of that situation, we need to think about sampling it a little bit differently. So the best thing would be if you would sample the hay as close to the time that you're going to feed it as possible. But I know for some people, I've heard that they're going to sample it when it comes out of the field, or it's probably not going to get sampled at all. So if that's your reality, if you're between not sampling or sampling it as soon as it comes out of the field, I'd rather you go ahead and take that sample as it comes out of the field to have a better idea. Even though it's not the preferred way, it's still you getting a forage test and it is a step in the right direction. So the tools that you will need to complete this would be a type of forage probe. And there's a lot of different types out there, and I'm going to go through 3 of the main types that I've seen. and your extension office most likely has one of these in it. If not, the neighboring county most likely has it. So if you don't have one, if you don't want to invest in one, get a hold of your local extension office and we can get you connected to one. So this first type of probe is one that's manual. So it just connects to this hand lever and you just use it in a rotating motion to kind of core through the hay bale. This is okay, but I have a feeling that this, the probe that's on it is probably too wide. And I'll talk more about that here in a minute. The second type is one that attaches to a drill. And this one's okay as well. Another problem with it being the section that it cuts out of the bale is too large. So you'll get a lot of material, more than you probably need from each bale. So you might be tempted to stop before you get the actual number of samples that you need. The other problem with the ones that are attached to the drill, I've heard that the batteries go out really quickly on those. So you want to have a couple extra battery packs in your hand. Or if you're lucky enough to be, say, in a barn somewhere testing that has electricity, you could use a corded drill. But there are some limitations, you know, with the actual drills that you're using for those types of probes. Finally, this is a probe that a lot of the extension offices have, I believe. It's called the hay check probe. So it is all manpower, no drill or anything required, and it's actually really easy to use for basically anyone. It's just more about getting the physics of using the probe right than it is actually having the manpower to do it. So the good thing about this probe is the actual piece that goes into the bale is fairly small. And so you're not tempted to stop before you get the correct number of samples from your lots of hay. So the other ones that we saw are like a 1/2 inch or more in diameter. And those get a lot of material, which the lab doesn't need. They only need like a cup or so total or less. Or maybe it's a pint. Anyways, they don't need much material, 1 or 2 cups total, and those large probes will give you a lot more than that once you get through the total number of bales that you need to sample, which we'll talk about here in a second. So then after you collect the sample, it's recommended to put it in like a plastic sealed Ziploc type bag to send off to the lab. So for a sampling technique, we're going to start with small and large square bales. You'll want to sample the bales at random, so don't pick, you know, the ones that look the nicest to you and ignore the ones that might look bad from the field. You need to do them all equally so that your test isn't skewed. So you'll want to sample in the middle of the hay bale. You can see in my PowerPoint there, recreated a fake square bale on the bottom right of where you would put it. So in between the wires on the butt end of the bale. And that is so that when the probe goes through, it's going to slice through several of the slices of hay, which is getting you a longer part of the field from that windrow than what you would do if you were trying to go from the sides. So for small squares, you want to take 1 core from 20 different bales. And then once you get all those cores taken, you're going to put them in your plastic bag and deliver them to the lab as soon as possible, either by mail or if you live close to one, you can usually drop them off if you arrange that ahead of time. An important note on step 4 is protect it from the heat. So you're not going to take this sample and leave it in the truck all day in the sun and let it bake and then send it into the lab. So that needs to be taken into consideration when you're planning your hay sampling. So I have a little demo video here about how to sample a square bale. So I'll just go in between the wires on the end, and this is the hay check probe, and you just use the force back and forth to push through. This is easier if you have a big stack, but this is just at my home and I didn't have a good stack of hay to do, so I made use with what I had here to show y'all. So that's me doing it. It's really simple. It's not hard. It doesn't take a lot of strength. I think just about anyone could do it. So round bells are a little bit different, but still similar technique. Sampling at random again, trying to limit your bias. Don't take the ones that look the best. At this, for the round bells, you're gonna sample on the sides of the bale at an angle towards the core. So you can see a little graphic I designed there. You're gonna take 2 core samples from 10 different bales. So you're still getting a 20 core sample, but you're only doing 10 bales for the round bales instead of 20 like we did in the small squares. Again, we're going from the side of the bale to get a larger portion of that field, because as the bale wraps, you're going to get like, farther stretch in the field through that bale than if you went from the other side and you'd only get one portion of the field. Seal the sample in your Ziploc bag and then send it off to the lab. So here is a video of how to sample on the round bale. Just put it in the side there. And round bales are actually easier to sample than the square bales are. And then we have a little wooden skewer that'll go on the probe to push that material down, and then you'll move on to your next sample. So you should sample each side of the bale, 10 different bales. So how do you select which lab to send your test to? There's a organization called the National Forage Testing Association, and they do quality checks every year for certain labs. They send in samples that they know the analysis of and check to see how close to accurate that lab is. And so the list from the recommended labs from that association is found at foragetesting.org. You can also contact your local extension educator and they can give you that list. So when you get your results back, you can contact your nutritionist if you have one. If you need help finding a nutritionist, you can contact your extension office. We have some on campus and at our Purdue Ag Centers throughout the state, and we can get you set up and headed in the right direction. So why do we go to all the trouble to sample all these bales and pay for the test and go to the extra effort? So I imagine a lot of people probably put hay in the barn as they harvest it. So when you get the first cutting, you put it along the back of the wall, second cutting goes in front and the next, and then third cutting's in the front. So when you're feeding that hay, you're obviously gonna feed third cutting first until you get through it, and then the second cutting, and then the first. And if you have multiple fields, it could all be mixed in there as well. So my recommendation instead of that system would be to test your hay, the different fields after each cutting. Keep track of that hay, so stack it in the barn, maybe left to right, in order so that it's easier to access. You can pull from different samples. And then once you get through all your cuttings that year and you have all your forage tests back, you can think about either restacking that hay, or if you stacked it in a system that would work that you could pull from any cutting, then you can plan your feeding throughout the year. That way you know what stage of production your cattle are at and what they're going to be at through the year. So the hay that's your highest quality, you can decide to feed at the correct time. So it could be when they're in late gestation or right after they give birth, when they have the highest needs to produce milk for that young. And also realizing that if you have a lot of mud in the spring, that's going to increase the animal's requirements. So maybe you need to save some higher quality hay for that point if they're fighting the mud and they need some extra energy from that hay. So then you can also supplement if you don't have hays that will fit well throughout all stages. You can select to buy hay or maybe trade hay with someone to better fit your needs, or you're going to know how to supplement those animals with the poor quality hay that you might have. So I know last year we had a really late first cutting in 2019. So there was a larger need to supplement with that hay than maybe in a normal year. And so then I just want to end by letting you know that we recently put out a publication called Sensory Analysis of Hay Quality. We really wrote it with a first-time buyer in hand, but if you've never gone through a sensory analysis of hay before, it'd be a really good start for that. So it's going to take you through what do you look at when you're going to purchase hay to decide if it may be something that would fit in your operation other than seeing the forage test. So looking through, can you identify the species in the bale just by seeing what grasses are there or what legumes may be present? Can you ID if there's any weeds in the bale? Can you look for insects that might be harmful? Is there mold? And a lot of different other things about smell. Does it smell like vinegar? Does it look like it's been wet and has started to smolder? So it's got this tobacco kind of smell, meaning it might have protein that is more bound and not available to the animal. So a lot of things you can go through. It's all summed up in this publication. And the numbers for it is AY374W. And if you can't find it, again, contact your extension educator and they will be able to help you find that. And it's just a really good publication to go through and use with your forage test to decide how you're going to utilize that hay that you have for that year. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lemonager.
Well, welcome to this evening's session. I'm Dr. Ron Lemonager. I'm the Beef Extension Specialist at Purdue University in the Department of Animal Science. And Bob asked me to kind of talk about where we're at with the market on this beef side of the equation during the coronavirus pandemic. And so one of the questions that has been raised is by some of our producers is why were the meat cases empty? You know, we've still got producers producing beef. We've got auction markets that are still open. We got packers still processing beef. We got trucks that are still rolling. So what's the problem? And I'm going to say in a nutshell, it's not a supply problem. It's a problem of demand and the shift in demand of product and distribution. So it becomes a logistics problem. If you look at food service versus retail, about 50% of the beef sales historically have been through food service. So think about the restaurants, the hotels, the institutional management kinds of things, the schools, those kinds of things. And when we went to basically shelter in place, what that's done is it moved all of the product and the distribution of product that would have gone through food service now is being forced into retail. And that doesn't sound like a big deal until you start thinking about, you know, what kind of products and how do the products arrive in food service? They come in large volumes, okay? So they come in cases. They come in maybe wholesale cuts, and then, you know, somebody like a Cisco or somebody would go through a further fab, all right? And the other part of it is, so different cuts, okay? Thinking about that, and I'll talk about that in here in just a minute. Size of cuts, pounds per package, and then the last piece is really about labeling. Whenever beef products go into food service, we don't have to have all the nutrition labels that we would have if we put it through the grocery store, for example, or maybe how to cook it, okay, that isn't on those labels. And so it's created a logistics problem, okay? The other part of it is that, you know, just like the toilet paper issue, all right, you know, where everybody went out and started hoarding toilet paper, well, people started hoarding beef as well and other products along with that. And so there's been a tremendous increase in the number of freezers, for example, that have been bought, refrigerators that have been bought. consumers have gone to the retail outlets, i.e. the grocery store, and really created a buying frenzy. Okay, and so if you think about a grocery store that maybe handles, I don't know, let's say 100 cases a week of beef product, all of a sudden now the demand is for something like 500 cases, all right? And this is now starting to slow down as freezers get full. And so the beef buying frenzy has actually tapered off a little bit, but that happened early in this process. The other problem is that warehouses where beef is stored, okay, and gets redistributed, okay, was working at capacity. For example, if a warehouse had the potential of dealing with 100,000 cases, now the demand was for 500,000 cases, and they just didn't have the capacity. They didn't have the manpower, and they didn't have the storage capacity, okay, to be able to deal with that. Adding to the top of that, now with the warehouses now handling more and more product and those kinds of things, now we start seeing detention times to offload and onload at some of these warehouses. So that gives you just a little bit of a feel for why maybe some of the retail cases were empty in some of the grocery stores. Again, it wasn't because of supply. It was really because of a change in demand and where beef products were going, and then the distribution system to make that work. So the reality is that we have record meat supplies in 2020. All right, broilers are up about 6% year over year, and first quarter it looks like they're going to be up about 7.7%. Pork is up about 4.4% year over year. First quarter probably up about 7.6%. Beef up 1.9 year over year, and probably in first quarter it's going to be about 6.6% when it's all said and done, when we get that data. But that's what the outlook looks like. So we have animal protein available for our consumers. It's just a matter of getting it in the right places. Recent reports indicate that about a 77% increase in year over year, and this was for the month of March, surge in at-home demand, all right? And it's just virtually overwhelmed the retail chain. And the graph that I've got down here in the bottom right kind of shows you kind of where we're at with poultry, the yellow line, pork, the red line, and beef, the blue line down here at the bottom in terms of red meat production. The next piece is where we at. So beef supplies are up 6% roughly year over year. And February placements into the feedlot, however, were down 8% year over year. March and April are expected, that was for February. March and April, when we get that data, is also expected to be lower as well. So that means that less cattle are going into the feedlots. The bottom line of that is that those cattle are going to be on feed for 120, 150 days. So 4 or 5 months down the road, we probably will see a lower supply of beef, okay? But that doesn't mean to say that we're not going to meet the domestic demand, all right? What that means is that hopefully we're going to see kind of the tail end of the coronavirus pandemic. Beef prices then should be a little bit higher because of supply and demand ratio, all right? Beef exports in February were the third highest month on record. We were up 15% year over year from a year ago. Year over year, about 18%. And what that translates to the export market for at least through the month of February, we were running about $343 a head value because we have an export market. A recent analysis of the American Farm Bureau Federation says that all nearby futures are down. And of course, there's a lot of volatility in the marketplace. And so you got to pick a point, okay? But as of just prior to April 9th, all nearby futures were down. Ethanol was down 40%. I'm going to come back to ethanol here in just a little bit. Corn was down 15%, soybeans 10, wheat 3. The export market is holding that wheat demand, okay? So while it's down, it's not down as much as some of the other cereal grains. Beef and pork are down 30% in terms of prices, and milk was down by about 30%. This graph just gives you a little bit of an illustration. If you go all the way back to the first of the year, okay, on the far left-hand side, and then you can kind of see what's happened as we kind of come in this time frame. All right, and I got to move my computer here just a little bit. But if you look at this point of the graph, that's kind of when we started getting information about the coronavirus, and it started having an effect on futures prices. And then as we went through the month of February, we can see what's kind of happened. And I'll just point out, here's corn, the yellow line. Here's wheat up here at the purple line. Soybeans are this green line. Live cattle is this purple line. All right, so we saw a pretty significant drop in futures prices, okay, as a result of the coronavirus, particularly during the month of March. Now, I mentioned that we had logistical issues, and if you look at the United States kind of as a whole, we've got produce that's being left in the field. We've got dairy farmers that are dumping milk, and ironically, the grocery stores in some parts of the country have actually put a limit on how many gallons or quarts or pints or whatever of milk that you could buy, when in fact, okay, milk supply was not limiting. All right, and so the dairy industry has been trying to deal with that issue, making sure that the grocery stores understand. But the reality is that dairy farmers are actually dumping milk, particularly up in Wisconsin and in the Northeast. We talked a little bit about beef demand. We said it was up. We had empty meat cases, and I said supply was not an issue. The other part of that was that retail prices went up, all right, during some of this. While the problem is that live animal and future prices were down about 25%. This is causing some concern among not only the beef industry, but National Cattlemen's Association has taken a very strong stand about maybe it's time to investigate why were the packers, and I think I'll show you that here in just a second. But let me talk about this table first, all right? If you look at this table, okay, this goes from the average price, box beef price was $207 in early part of March. Beginning about the 12th of March, okay, beef prices started to go up. And if you look at a 3-day period, all right, March 16th, 17th, and 18th, choice box beef cutouts went up 19% in 3 days. If you look at about 7 days, it went up by 24%. Now, admittedly, it has come down probably about 10% from that, okay? Now, what products, are you seeing me? You don't need to see my face, right?
Yeah, we can see your face, but our screen is taken up mostly by your presentation.
Okay, I'm gonna shut this down just a little bit so I can see my screen. Maybe I can do it this way. All right. So when you look at wholesale beef prices, it's kind of interesting to see how prices have changed. And so this is the weekly price change, okay, from middle of March to the 1st of April. Ribeyes were down 7.7%. Why was that? Because ribeyes really have been targeted towards the restaurant and food service industry, all right? The shoulder and clods, okay, were retail and hamburger, all right? They went up almost 50%. The petite tender was typically a restaurant item, all right, now is being forced into the grocery store, off 32%. The chuck roll, again, has gone to retail and hamburger historically, all right? The demand for hamburger has gone up, okay? 32% increase in value of the chuck roll. Briskets have typically been a sweetheart of food service. It's down 9%. Short ribs, okay, typically go into the export market. So, the global trade has kind of been disrupted a little bit as well. So down about 50%. top inside round, basically all of the rounds, okay, have been typically gone into retail and hamburger, all right? And you can kind of see what happens in terms of the prices, 33, 46, 25% increase. Strip loin and top sirloin have also increased, okay? The strip loin is typically been goes into grilling, okay? We're kind of coming into the grilling season, and now that people are kind of locked in at home, what are they going to have? Something that they understand. Number one is strip steaks, okay? So Kansas City, New York strips, okay, and hamburger, all right? And much less so the ribeye, all right? If you look at the tenderloin, all right, the tenderloin has lost significantly in value because, again, that has been typically a restaurant situation. If you look at another study, all right, or another breakout of data, okay, fed cattle prices just in the last week, and this is April 8th report, all right, fed cattle prices went from $1.20 down to $1.11, $1.12, all right? And if you're looking at some of the futures markets, okay, you may say, well, you know, they're even down a little bit, they're down more than that, okay? But this is kind of this week's fed cattle prices, so these are more of the live prices. The other thing that we're seeing is that carcass weights, okay, don't look much different here, but the reality is that we've gained about 25 pounds year over year in terms of carcass weights. That's added, again, more product to the marketplace. The certified Angus beef cutout, okay, is down about 16 bucks a hundredweight. Choice cutouts down about $7 a hundredweight. Select cattle cutouts are down about $7 a hundredweight, and the select choice spread still in that roughly $11 range. Here is kind of the fed versus futures market, just to kind of show you that graphically. And so what I've circled is basically this line right here, all right? So this is 2020, okay? And you can kind of see since January 6th, which is the beginning here, all right, what's happened to fed cattle prices. So these are fat cattle selling on a live basis in the five-state area, all right? And we've started to come back up a little bit, all right? And I hope that line kind of continues. If you look over here on the right side, okay, the second graph, okay, you can kind of see what happens to live cattle futures, okay, as we kind of come through February and March. We typically will start to see a decline in those live cattle futures prices anyway, because of, you know, we're going to be bringing in calves, okay, the calves are going to start coming out of the feed yards. They're going to be a little bit lighter than typically the yearling cattle. And so we typically will see this, but in about roughly a 15-day period, we saw an 8% drop, another 15-day period, about 17% drop, and then we saw an 18% increase, and then we've seen a drop off, and hopefully this line has now got a little bit of a hook on it and it's starting to come back a little bit. Feeder calf prices kind of follow the same trend as the fed cattle, all right? Dark blue line is 400 and 500 pound cattle in Oklahoma City. The dash line is 500 and 600 pound cattle, and you can kind of see what's happened again since the first of the year. And I looked at futures prices this morning, and they, on feeder calves, they continue to go up. Fat cattle have kind of, at least based on trade over day, kind of flatline. So here's feeder calf futures. It follows a very similar trend to the fed cattle market. Rapid change in live to cutout spread. And again, I circled a spot. Okay, so this is 2020. Okay, and I put an arrow on this dark blue line. This is where the concern is at. Okay, you know, of packers taking advantage of, I'll say the live cutout spread. And so there is kind of a call for an investigation, and it was this investigation is really tacked onto the Tyson plant fire that took place, you know, 6 or 8 months ago. You know, as to how do the live cattle and the box beef prices or the cutout prices, how could they be so different? And so basically, this was a $500 spread, of which most of this improvement actually went to the packer. Now, the packers have dropped significantly off from this line. So this one happens to go out to March 5th, and I didn't have a more current line, but that line has actually come down. So was it just a temporary blurb, okay, or is this, price manipulation? We can make those arguments, and I'm not going to make judgment one way or the other. In terms of cattle sales, bull sales and auction markets, with the whole issue of social distancing has limited participation, but the livestock markets tell me that basically the serious buyers are showing up, and they're asking spectators to stay away. And one of the markets up in the northern part of the state, they're limiting it to 40 buyers, and they're spreading out more than 6 feet from each other. Changing the way people pay, changing the way people deliver cattle and pick up cattle and that kind of stuff. And of course, the old buffet line that might have happened, particularly at some of the old bull sales, but also the auction markets, the sit-down restaurants. Obviously, that's all been dispersed. And if there's going to be lunch, it basically has gone to lunchbox to go, and you go and you sit apart from, it's no longer the social gathering that it once was. We've seen an increased use in online sales with private viewing, okay, prior to the sale, okay, so to minimize the number of people interacting. And it seems like those online sales are going very well, all right? So, if you're a buyer, you're kind of like, in fact, we were looking at some cattle online that I had an interest in from a genetics perspective, and the cattle sold for more than what I was kind of hoping that I might have been able to get them for. Okay, so the sales seem to be going very well. One other issue relative to cattle sales, the meat exports to Canada. USDA FSIS, which is the Food Inspection Service, has simplified the regulations for particularly the packers that are moving product from the United States into Canada, okay, on the trade agreement. And so what we hope to see is an increased meat export to Canada and Mexico to kind of help shore up some of our cattle prices locally. I mentioned a little bit earlier that ethanol was down about 40% on the futures. In the early to late March timeframe, okay, gasoline use dropped 46%. Gas prices at the pumps dropped significantly, and there was a parallel drop in ethanol use, all right? The expectation is that over 50% of the United States ethanol plants will be offline, okay? And that is an issue here in Indiana, because we've had a number of our producers that have been using distillers grains, both in our feedlot rations, as well as supplements to our cow herds and our growing and developing heifers and bulls. Basically, ethanol byproducts or distillers grains is a commodity that's really hard to find, if you can find it at all. And the reality of that is that the blending economies, it's basically if you were a gas company, okay, and you were adding octane boosters, which ethanol is an octane booster, and that's why we put 10% roughly into most of the gas that gets produced. It turns out that the other octane boosters have, number one, a little bit more energy, okay, and they're about the same price, all right? And so what we're seeing is that while we've been ratcheting along here in this top graph at about 10% ethanol incorporation into gas, okay, until we get out here and all of a sudden this has dropped, all right? And so if you look at the price differential between these other octane boosters and ethanol, the other octane boosters are cheaper, okay? And when you put them on an energy adjusted basis, all right, because ethanol is lower in energy than most of the octane boosters, that price differential gets a little bit even bigger, all right? So the gas companies are kind of, from an economics perspective, have kind of gone to the other ethanol or octane boosters at the expense of ethanol, and that's lowered the price of ethanol, along with a lower demand for gasoline in general. So we've got very limited to no supplies of distillers grains. The alternatives to this, from a protein perspective, is soybean meal or extruded soybeans, corn gluten feed. If you're in a feedlot scenario, urea could be added as a nitrogen source that would have a protein equivalent. Urea does not work well in cow diets, okay, because they're high forage diets, all right? But when we start adding starch like corn, urea and corn work very well together. Urea and forages do not work very well together, all right? And it's all about carbon chains and ammonia coming together to make microbial protein. And we don't get the right combination and from a timing perspective whenever we feed urea on a high forage diet. Commercial protein supplements are obviously another alternative to all of that. So, you know, here's a situation. In fact, I'm working with a producer right now to try to reformulate his feedlot rations because basically he can't get any more distillers grains. From an energy perspective, distillers grains do bring energy to the table. That means that we're probably going to have to substitute corn in at a little bit higher level, particularly on the feedlot side. And we could consider adding some soybean hulls or corn skins, you know, these highly digestible fiber byproducts when we talk about supplementation for the cow herd. And these soybean hulls and corn skins would be almost a one-to-one substitution for corn in a high forage diet. The concerns whenever we start thinking about dropping the distillers grains out is that the energy in distillers grains comes from a very digestible fiber and from fat, but there's no starch, all right? So when we take that out of the ration at a fairly significant contribution, maybe 25 to 35% of the ration, that means I'm going to substitute back 25 to 30% of the ration with something, all right? It's going to be a combination probably of soybeans, extruded soybeans, soybean meals, extruded soybean meal, or urea, okay, or something that has actually a higher level of protein than the distillers grains, all right? So it's going to be included at a smaller amount than distillers grains. It won't be a one-to-one. That means I'm probably going to have to pick up the energy with corn, and that means an increase in starch. And so we do have the risk of acidosis increase, all right? So we've got to be a little bit careful. It's going to be just a little bit of a new ball game. And so bunk management is going to become really a key piece. The other alternative to all of that is to increase roughage content, all right, in our diets. In other words, make those diets a little bit less energy dense to help offset the increased risk of acidosis. And again, working with a nutritionist can help you work through that. The concerns for the cow herd, if we're going to substitute energy, make sure that you limit corn to no more than about 0.3% of body weight per day. So as an example, a 1,300 pound cow times 0.003 is about 4 pounds of corn a day, all right? When you go above that, what's going to happen is you're going to drop the rumen pH, okay, which is going to make the rumen environment less capable of digesting the forages, okay, that are in your ration. So about 3.5, 4 pounds of corn per day is going to be kind of our upper limit on most of our cow herds. And then the other one is soybean hulls. If you're going to use that, you need to make sure that you limit it to about 1% of body weight or less. So again, a 1,300 pound cow at 1% of her body weight is about 13 pounds. A 500 pound calf is about 5 pounds. Okay, so, and the reason for that is that because the soybean hulls are a fairly tight pellet, whenever they hit the liquid of the rumen, they're going to expand in size about 7 or 8 times. And what we start to see when we start getting above 1% of body weight, okay, intake of soybean hulls, that hard pellet, is that we can start to run into some bloat problems. Okay, so it's just another little caution. Just a couple comments about the CARES Act. Okay, the $2 trillion or $2.2 trillion Congress appropriated bills. About 23.5 billion goes for direct producer assistance. All right. Of that, 14 billion goes under borrowing authority. Okay, under the Commodity Corporation, Credit Corporation, and probably are not going to see too many checks for that one. All right, because that's really going to support existing programs. All right, and not basically a new program. There's about 9.5 billion for specialty crop growers, direct retail farm, and livestock operators. So this is where ranchers and dairy will maybe come out. All right, but if you think about corn and soybeans up here in that 14 billion, okay, it's probably going to be kind of business as usual. Okay, with the current federal programs in place, and that's where this money is going to come from. USDA and Congress and National Cattlemen's Beef Association, Farm Bureau, and U.S. Cattlemen's Association all have signed on to a letter went to President Trump, okay, and Secretary Perdue to push this appropriations to the producers as quickly as possible. Another 45.5 million for rural businesses and utilities. Okay, so the utilities are for electricity and hopefully some internet capability. Okay, now that we don't have schools in session and we've got students that are doing e-learning in rural communities, trying to shore up their ability to be able to capture an internet. Another 24.8 billion for emergency food systems. So the old SNAP program is in here, okay, at a higher level. Food for kids is in here at a higher level, et cetera. Now, the details of how funds are going to be dispersed has really not been yet announced, but I thought I'd give you what we know is kind of the most up-to-date information on the CARES Act, okay? I don't know where I'm at on time, but if I could take just a...
We have 10 minutes left in our normal time, but we can't extend past it. So don't worry about running over.
So let me, in the next 10 minutes, kind of talk about early season grazing and when to turn out. Keith Johnson and I did a video, and it's on beeftips.info. So go to URL beeftips.info, and we talk about early season turnout, okay, to protect the season-long production. But obviously soil conditions need to be a consideration. The last few days have been a very good drying, and so if cows are out on pasture, at least in my part of the state right now, it wouldn't be an issue from a mud standpoint. But what the next few days, the next few weeks is going to look like, if we start getting rain, okay, pugging, okay, or those deep hoof tracks, okay, in your pastures, that could become a problem. Okay, I got less than 4 inches if you're going to be on a rapid rotation. In other words, if you're going to have to turn out, then you're going to have to go through your cells, okay, fairly quickly. Okay, so like 1 to 2 day rotations, and rotate through very quickly. If you're going to have delayed rotations, okay, you probably need to be at least 6 inches in height. And if you're going to go out for a continuous graze, if you have no rotational grazing system, you probably better be over 8 inches in height. Okay. The idea here is that you want these cows to get a full bite, okay, and not just have to nibble. All right. The other challenge that we've got with this early season grazing is that dry matter intake is a challenge, and basically cows can't eat enough to meet their nutrient requirements. A 1,300 pound cow is going to eat 120 to 130 pounds of wet forage a day. We normally think that dry matter intake is going to be the limiting factor. Well, in this case, it's not dry matter. It is gut fill, which is a combination of dry matter, which is only about 10%, okay? And moisture is about 90%, and I think I've got this wrong on the slide. This should be 90% moisture, okay? And so when you take 120 or 130, you're looking at about 13 pounds of dry matter for a 1,300-pound cow, when in fact she needs 26 to 32 pounds of dry matter, or the equivalent of eating 260 to 320 pounds of wet product. So understand, and the most vulnerable, okay, in this scenario at turnout at the beginning of the grazing season would be if we have cattle, females, okay, beef cows and heifers that are at the beginning of the breeding season. If these cattle start to crash on energy, and especially the young females and bulls, all right, you know, these replacement heifers were gaining somewhere 1.5 pounds, 1.75 pounds a day, all winter long to get to 60%, 65% of their mature weight going into the beginning of the breeding season. We kick them out on grass. Those heifers can't eat enough during the early season to maintain weight, so they start losing weight. These heifers could very easily go into anestrus, all right? And then you wonder why these heifers didn't get bred early. All right, here's one of the reasons. If the early breeding season corresponds with the early grazing season, this loss in weight, because they can't eat enough energy in particular, becomes the problem. One other question, other thing that I've got producers that I've talked to, and I'm sure Dr. Keith Johnson probably has the same situation, okay? But, you know, people like to go out and spread nitrogen, all right, in the early season. Well, the early grazing season is also when we get most rapid forage growth, all right? So by putting nitrogen on early, we're going to create excess growth, all right, to the point that the cows probably can't keep up with it. So we're going to end up with more seed heads, which is going to lower the quality faster, all right? So some of the recommendations, and I didn't check this with Keith, all right, but if you wait a little bit into the grazing season, all right, the idea is that you could support growth of spring-initiated tillers, all right, if you waited 45 days, let's say, into the grazing season. So instead of putting it on late April, you know, you might be putting it on, you know, in early June, all right? 30 to 40% legume content in our pastures, which would be a recommendation anyway, should require no nitrogen fertilization. And because you've got the legumes in there, it should maintain forage quality longer and give you a longer high quality forage window, okay, for grazing purposes. Just a couple comments on seed heads. Last year, our cool season grasses experienced some ergot, okay, across the state. Ergot acts much like fescue foot, okay, or fescue toxicosis, where it's a vasoconstriction, okay, in the extremities. So tail, feet, ears, all right, those kinds of things, all right. And so today, I probably wouldn't be making that recommendation, but if spring is going to be wet and cool, all right, this ergot could pop up again this year, because if there was a little bit last year, the spores, okay, stay in the soil, okay, and they're ready to repopulate, and they could come back with a greater vengeance this year than they were in last year, all right? So some mitigation that you might think about is, number one, check your seed heads, okay, if you're going to do that. It looks like a little mouse dropping, okay, where the seed head is at, okay, so it looks like a seed, okay, but a mouse dropping in terms of appearance. So if you control seed head development, particularly in pastures, you will minimize the ergot intake by the animals, all right? And you can do that by grazing management, okay, or you could do it by clipping seed heads. If you're talking about hays, okay, trying to get your hay made before you get seed head development, okay, or, you know, so it can go through pollination, but once the ergot starts to grow during pollination, and then it becomes very evident okay, whenever we get that little mouse dropping appearance in the seed head, all right? So those are just a couple comments. Real quickly, okay, if you're going to make baleage this year, we've had several cases of botulism and listeria that Dr. Johnson and I have been involved with. Okay, if you're going to make baleage, you want a pH less than 4.5. That will minimize how much botulism and listeria can grow in that stored forage. So my comment here is that if you're going to make baleage, make sure that you pay attention to details. You want a moisture content of 50 to 60%. If it's too low, it won't ferment properly. If it's too high, it still won't ferment properly. And if it's too high, you'll get butyric acid and lactic acid, okay? And you'll get lactic acid you'll get butyric acid fermentation instead of a lactic acid fermentation. And that's not desirable, okay? You don't want the butyric acid, it's a sour smell. Minimize soil contamination because both botulism and listeria, okay, come by way of soil contamination, okay? And you can also get botulism and listeria from dead animals, okay, being in your hays. So watch your bale density. The tighter the bale, the better. Try to get uniform bale size so that whenever, particularly if you're using an inline wrapper, that you can exclude as much oxygen as possible because of minimizing air gaps, both in the bale itself and then bale size, okay? You know, that little triangle that forms between a small bale and a tall bale in terms of the plastic and how it wraps. Okay, at that point, I'm going to quit. I should be fairly close to time. And if you've got any questions, okay, you're welcome to ask right now, or you can contact me at either through my normal email, which is rpl@Purdue, or askdrron@purdue.edu. Either one of those emails work, or my cell phone number is 765-427-5972.